Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar in the CERTIP and ESTCP webinar series. My name is Jennifer Nyman. I'm a principal at Geosyntec Consultants in Oakland, California, and the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of CERTIP and ESTCP. I will be facilitating today's call. The webinar will consist of a brief overview of CERTIP and ESTCP by Dr. Kurt Preston. After Kurt's opening remarks, we will transition to the technical portion of the webinar. Today's event focuses on DoD research, quantifying and modeling fugitive dust emissions. First, Dr. Larry Wagner of the U.S. Department of Agriculture will describe work on fugitive dust from off-road activities and development of an aerosol sensing system. His presentation will be followed by a question and answer session. Next, Dr. Jack Gillies of the Desert Research Institute will present on the quantification and modeling of dust emissions from DoD activities. His presentation will also be followed by a question and answer session. We will conclude the webinar with a final Q&A session with both speakers. Today's broadcast will be listen only. You may submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of your screen. You do not need to wait until that Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit questions in advance of that session. On this slide, we have provided a few suggestions in case you experience difficulties with the broadcast audio. Typically, any delay will be fixed if you refresh your screen or call into the conference line. However, if you continue to have problems, please submit a comment using the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. Kurt Preston, who is the CERTIP Program Manager for the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program. Dr. Preston has tracked his career between the civilian university and military positions. As the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, he led faculty development efforts to improve research competitiveness and worked with technology transfer personnel, academic departments, and colleges to build university research capabilities. He has served as a member of the Chief of the Army Corps of Engineers Environmental Advisory Board. Kurt?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's CERTIP and ESTCP webinar. CERTIP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established in 1991 by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the Environmental Protection Agency. CERTIP's mission is to identify and address high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on Department of Defense requirements. CERTIP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impacts real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program in which we demonstrate innovative environmental and energy technologies. These investments capitalized on past investments under CERTIP and other research programs and are designed to transition technologies out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. CERTIP and ESTCP are complementary programs, with much of CERTIP research occurring in the lab and pilot scale with occasional field efforts, while ESTCP demonstrations are primarily at the pilot and field scale, though occasionally sporting lab efforts are conducted. There are 4 program areas in CERTIP and 5 in ESTCP. The Energy and Water program area is only in ESTCP, while the other 4, environmental restoration, munitions response, resource conservation and resiliency, and weapon systems and platforms, are CERTIP and ESTCP programs managed jointly by a designated program manager. Our webinar today is focusing on research and demonstrations that were conducted under the Resource Conservation and Resiliency Program area, which has essentially three main thrust areas of research: natural resources, wildland fire management, and resiliency. Our webinar series highlights research and demonstration efforts from each of the 5 program areas. As you can see, upcoming webinars will cover a broad range of topics. The next Resource Conservation and Resiliency webinar is on May 3rd, and it will focus on providing an overview of the Defense Coastal and Estuary Research Program, DCERP. You can find more information about upcoming webinars at this link. Registration is now live for webinars through the end of the year. And I would like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar webpage. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast today. I'm also pleased to announce that the CERTIP ESTCP Symposium will be held for the 2nd year in a row this upcoming November in Washington, D.C. The 3-day event will showcase the latest technologies that enhance DoD's mission through improved environmental and energy performance. Registration information will be available shortly on the CERTIP and ESTCP website. For now, I hope you enjoy the webinar today.
Excellent. Thank you, Kurt. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Larry Wagner, an agricultural engineer who has worked for the United States Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Research Service for 29 years. He was formerly part of the Wind Erosion Research Unit in Manhattan, Kansas, and recently moved to the Rangeland Resources and Systems Research Unit in Fort Collins, Colorado. Dr. Wagner's current work revolves around basic wind erosion, as well as the continued development and enhancement of the wind erosion prediction system. He has authored more than 25 peer-reviewed research papers, as well as more than 70 additional publications. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in agricultural engineering and a doctoral degree in engineering from Kansas State University in Manhattan, Kansas. Larry?
Okay. So the agenda for my presentation today will cover the background of this particular project and the technical approach for the 2 components of it, the off-road trafficking and the development of a eye-safe Lidar system. And then we'll cover those results and the DoD benefits, and then follow up with the conclusions and the acknowledgements. DoD military training and testing is conducted on approximately 12 million hectares of land. Much of it is in arid regions that are highly susceptible to particulate emissions and wind erosion. Typical vehicles used by the military on off-road conditions, such as lands, consist of both wheeled and tracked vehicles, which are usually much heavier than comparable civilian vehicles. Operating military vehicles on such lands not only generate particulate emissions during trafficking, as shown in the top 2 photos, but also often leaves the land at an increased risk for wind erosion following trafficking events during training and testing exercises. DoD not only has concerns about particulate emissions caused by military maneuvers and wind erosion on DoD lands, but also particulate emissions drifting across installation boundaries and potentially impacting downwind civilian regions. which often have significant air quality concerns of their own to deal with. DoD also expressed a need for measuring and monitoring particulate emissions at installation boundaries, with the desire to have a cost-effective device developed that could achieve that goal. We conducted field experiments between 2010 and 2014 at 4 military sites within the United States: at Fort Riley, Kansas, Fort Benning, Georgia, Yakima Training Center in the state of Washington, and White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. These sites consisted of a broad range of soils and climates. The map at the top shows geographically where the sites were located in the United States. The upper photo on the right side shows the regions of wind erosion-prone croplands in the United States as deemed by Natural Resource Conservation Service, and the bottom right photo shows the soil texture map with the soils at the test centers highlighted as red dots. Multi-pass trafficking field experiments were carried out on all 4 previously mentioned U.S. DoD military training sites. At each site, a heavy tracked vehicle, such as an M1A1 tank or equivalent, which is approximately 50 to 60,000 kilograms, and a light wheeled vehicle, normally a Humvee, in the range of 3,000 to 4,000 kilograms, were used, except at the Yakima Training Center, where there were no tracked vehicles, and we used a heavier 15,000 kilogram 6-wheeled tanker fire truck for the heavy vehicle. The vehicles were driven in figure-8 patterns in cumulative sets of passes to represent roughly a low, medium, and high level of disturbance. 1 or 2 soil types were trafficked at each site in 3 replications for each vehicle-soil combination. After each set of passes, measurements were made and samples extracted for later laboratory analysis to characterize the surface susceptibility to wind erosion and potential emissions of fine particulates. Within the 40-meter by 80-meter rectangles, figure-8 plots were laid out at each experimental site for multi-trafficking exercises, as shown in the bottom right photo. Figure-8 design allowed for both straight and curved trafficking effects to be studied on the same trafficking plots. Each measurement or sample was generally taken at specific locations along the figure-8, denoted by the 2-letter symbols in the left photo, to include both curved and straight traffic regions within the track. So in this case, the CC was the center cross traffic section, which got twice as much trafficking as the rest of the figure-8. The SS was the straight sections, and the CI and the CO were the inside and outside curved regions. This figure-8 design has been used by other researchers as well, so we expect that the data that we obtained can be compared across experimental projects. We collected a suite of wind erosion relevant data before and after each set of trafficking passes on the figure-8 plots. A completely randomized split plot experimental design was chosen to develop an appropriate statistical analysis of variance for dust emissions, which were measured in a laboratory wind tunnel, as well as the other measurements taken in the field. Sampling location, for example, straight path versus curved path, multi-pass, and soil effects were examined for both wheeled and tracked vehicles independently. Shown here are wind tunnel trays samples being extracted from the straight trafficked region of a figure-8 plot before and after each set of trafficking experiments. Traffic conditions consisted of 1, 5, and 10 cumulative passes for the tracked vehicles and 10, 25, and 50 cumulative passes for the wheeled vehicles. In the upper corner is a diagram of the laboratory wind tunnel where the wind tunnel trays were placed in and tests were run. We ran 5-minute laboratory wind tunnel tests to determine the emission of loose, wind-erodible particulates from the surface under a non-abrader condition, which was only wind being applied, and an abrader condition where 5 kilograms of siltation sand was applied upwind of the tunnel and blown across the trays. Shown here is vegetation sampling in the top right photo in the collection of surface aggregates, which were taken to the laboratory and rotary sieved to split them out into their different size distributions, with the non-erodible aggregates generally being considered those greater than 0.84 millimeters in diameter, and those smaller than that being considered wind erodible. Also, as a part of the suite of wind erosion relevant data collected before and after trafficking on the figure 8 plots, we measured surface roughness with a pin meter, took particulate emission measurements with a PI-SWERL, a portable in situ wind erosion laboratory, shown in the right photo. This device was designed and developed by the Desert Research Institute, initially for research on unpaved roads and natural surface conditions. Additional measurements not shown here also included collecting bulk density and moisture content samples at 5, 10, and 15 centimeter depths, categorizing and identifying plant species, as well as clipping and weighing those vegetation samples out of each of those plots. In addition to the original trafficking experiments, we also attempted to evaluate the short-term response to trafficking. We did so by collecting additional vegetation and soil data approximately 1 year after the trafficking experiments were conducted. This time frame was selected to allow at least a year of natural climatic overwintering processes such as freeze-thaw, freeze-dry, snowing, etc., as well as natural wet and dry cycles due to precipitation to occur and impact the original after-trafficking site conditions. And if you look at the photos on the right side, you can see that we had snow in Fort Riley, and when that snow melted and soaked into the surface, that it created puddling and crusting, which in this particular case, with no vegetation, that crusted surface would help protect it against wind erosion compared to the initial non-crusted conditions after the trafficking. The bottom 2 photos shows the before and after photos at White Sands Missile Range, so you can see the additional vegetation regrowth that occurred after a year of precipitation occurring. The second major portion of the project was to design, build, and test a prototype eye-safe Lidar system that could eventually be used for real-time measurement of fugitive dust concentrations and be suitable for monitoring installation fence line particulate matter levels. To meet the eye-safe requirements, the near-infrared wavelength of 1574 nanometers laser was used along with a beam expansion to make it eye-safe at the aperture. Benefits of the Lidar is that it can be used to scan it, the surface, plane, and provide a 2D image of the plume quickly over a large area. It can track the plume over time and pinpoint the source location. And in combination with meteorological and PM concentration data, one can simulate a wall or group of PM sensors with a single Lidar device. Top figure shows the sealess system with the command and control boxes and a weather station. The bottom figure is a concept diagram of the DoD fugitive dust relevant sealess deployment, where sealess could be used as a boundary of interest to determine when and where dust plumes cross and potentially plume concentrations. It can alternatively be used to detect plumes and identify potential sources. Immediately visually obvious is that military trafficking is destructive. Repeated trafficking removes surface vegetation, and severe trafficking can even remove roots of hardy perennial grasses. Once the vegetation cover is gone, the surface soil is continually impacted by repeated trafficking, pulverizing any existing surface aggregates and severely compacting the soil if sufficient moisture exists, as shown in these photos from Fort Riley, Kansas. In addition, fragile soils that may have built up a non-erodible protective crust over time or created a desert pavement on the surface are immediately disturbed and destroyed on the very first vehicle pass. In the absence of vegetative cover, these protective surfaces do aid in reducing a site's susceptibility to wind erosion. It takes significant time, often measured in years, for arid region sites to naturally rebuild this kind of surface protection naturally. The expected general results were found from this study. First, that tracked vehicles were more destructive than the wheeled vehicles, especially when turning. Heavier vehicles caused more damage than lighter vehicles. Turning was more destructive than driving straight, regardless of the type of vehicle, due to the shearing forces that occur in the turns, and that multiple passes are more destructive than a single pass. Tracked vehicles would essentially do all the vegetative damage or removal in the first pass on the curves, but subsequent passes would continue to degrade the soil aggregate structure and size of those aggregates on the surface, as well as continue to remove vegetation cover on the straight sections. The lighter wheeled vehicles, since they generated less force on the surface and reduced shearing in the curves, required multiple passes to do the same level of damage that a heavier tracked vehicle would do in a single pass. Photos shown here are all from Fort Riley, Kansas. The left photo shows the effects of a single pass with an Abrams tank. The middle photo shows a Humvee during the trafficking testing, rounding the curve of the figure 8 and showing the effects of the shearing forces on the curves. And the right photo shows the effect of 10 passes with an M1A1 Abrams tank, clearly showing the differences in effects when trafficking in a straight line compared to turning with the tank. Vegetation cover is the best protection against wind erosion. At White Sands Missile Range, we were lucky and they had above average precipitation, nearly 50% more than normal during the 10 months following our trafficking study. Thus, it presented us with excellent or optimal results when we reevaluated the sites for their subsequent natural response to the trafficking at White Sands compared to the conditions immediately after trafficking. Notice that besides the vegetation growth, it is apparent visually that the localized microhabitat has diversified due to the deep tracks created by the tracked vehicle collecting and infiltrating additional surrounding water from excess of infiltration during the precipitation events. Takeaway here is that trafficking disturbance is not necessarily all bad in the long term if the conditions are correct. At White Sands Missile Range, the wheeled traffic plots had recovered so much that we could barely distinguish some of the original figure 8 plots. We had to walk the figure 8s and look closely to actually find the tracks and place flags within the original wheel tracks to identify the plot locations. Shown here, the top right photo is the surface condition immediately following 50 passes with a Humvee. The left photo shows the animal activity and the flattening of the curved section of a wheeled vehicle in the figure 8 plot 10 months after the original trafficking. In the bottom right photo, if you look closely, you can see that we've got some flags out there marking where the figure 8s are. You cannot actually identify where the figure 8s are without the flags out there. These photos exemplify the effects of multi-pass straight-line trafficking with a heavy tracked vehicle. In this case, it was an M88A1 tank retriever that we used at White Sands Missile Range. Note the complete removal of vegetation in the figure 8 straight-tracked areas. The left photo shows the straight section, and the upper part of the photo we can see the center cross sections of the figure 8. The right photo at the same location, approximately 10 months later, shows the center cross section clearly well revegetated. In fact, the vegetation growth in the tracked region is more pronounced than the vegetation on the untrafficked region next to it. The results of the above average rainfall for this region and the apparent seeding into the soil of the grama grass seeds lying on the surface due to repeated trafficking is clearly shown here. So the trafficking effects here show at least a temporary benefit of a significantly increased amount of vegetation cover that can occur under desirable climatic conditions. This also implies that there is potential in remedial management practices that can stimulate these kinds of conditions, such as increased artificial application of water or irrigation and possible seeding into the soil of desired native vegetation to improve seed germination conditions. This photo shows the technician crew collecting the suite of wind erosion-related data from the figure 8 plots following a trafficking event at Fort Riley, Kansas. The suite of experimental data collected and analyzed is useful for developing algorithms reflecting the impact of repeated trafficking under different soil, vegetation, and climatic conditions with various military vehicles. In this project, we developed compaction equations and vegetation cover decay due to repeated trafficking and incorporated them into the process-based wind erosion model, the wind erosion prediction system. Additional analysis and algorithms can be developed for the other collected data as well. All multi-traffic data were collected and analyzed. Statistical analysis showing significance of differences by vehicle, track type, soil were reported. Shown here is a series of graphs on a single plot for one vehicle, which was the six-wheeled fire truck at Yakima Training Center on a single soil. It is showing the loss of vegetative cover versus the number of vehicle passes made on that figure 8 plot. Fire truck data shows a typical response of more rapid vegetative cover loss in the curve sections of the figure 8 compared to the straight sections. This is similar statistical and comparative analysis is presented in the paper, the final report for all the soil, vegetation, and laboratory measured surface emission data collected. Decay function algorithms were developed from this type of data, which can be incorporated directly into other models to represent the loss of vegetation cover with increasing number of vehicle passes. Likewise, similar response functions were also developed for loss of vegetation mass and the compaction effects due to the military pass trafficking as well. Directly actionable DoD benefits of this study are the recommendations for reducing the degree of damage caused by multi-pass trafficking and the possible remedial actions that can be applied, when necessary, to alleviate the increased wind erosion risk caused by off-road trafficking. The left photo here shows an example of a water truck that could be used to temporarily irrigate or water off-road trafficking lanes, thus enhancing germination conditions and regrowth of vegetation, thereby reducing and or eliminating the increased risk to wind erosion post-trafficking at many arid and semi-arid military sites. The top right photo shows an example of an agricultural no-till drill that can seed into existing vegetation and residue without requiring pre-plant tillage operations. Such drills would likely be ideal to improve native vegetation cover more quickly than allowing Mother Nature to normally do it by itself, especially if followed up with managed water applications to enhance germination and early vegetation growth in arid regions. Bottom right photo shows the results of a rancher achieved using this practice to reseed bare areas in an overgrazed pasture land. This is a positive example of the resulting germination and subsequent vegetation growth following the use of a no-till drill. Initial field testing was performed at the West Desert Testing Range at the Dugway Proving Ground during release of various aerosols. The left picture is the CELIS at the measurement site with the pan and tilt stage active with the command and control center in the trailer to the right of it. And on the right picture is a raw image of a horizontal radial scan taken by CELIS during an Arizona road dust release. The straight line in the lower half is slanted from top left to lower right. There's a large patch at the top of the Lidar image, which was vegetation and ground image being picked up there. But the takeaway here is that CELIS is capable of detecting dust plumes and tracking their movement and or identifying the likely source location if it's within the field of view of the Lidar. Continued testing of CELIS at the Joint Ambient Breeze Tunnel facility was also done at Dugway, allowing for direct comparisons with one of Dugway Proving Ground's own LiDAR systems called Sample or Scanning Aerosol Micropulse LiDAR, which is also an eye-safe LiDAR. But they used it as a reference system for testing and evaluating CELIS. In the figures, the left top was the Joint Ambient Breeze Tunnel, the long warehouse structure with controlled uniform flow from one end to the other, where various aerosols can be released within it for testing of standoff detection equipment. The dimensions are roughly 75 meters by 350 meters. Right top graph is showing PM10 emissions or concentrations on a color scale calculated from the reference sample LiDAR system. And the right bottom was the PM10 concentrations calculated from CELIS. Takeaway here is that CELIS performed very well compared to the reference near-infrared LiDAR sample system that it was compared to. The CELIS LiDAR systems are built on demand, requiring a long lead time. Some parts have a 4+ month lead time. CELIS, but there is a disclaimer here that CELIS has not yet been tested in a continuous or completely autonomous operating mode, where testing has not exceeded 1 week of daily use at this point in time. There are still the requirement for trained and educated users currently to required for optimal operation, maintenance, and data production. PM concentrations are not yet an automated data product from this system. It can only be done right now with supporting data and specialized post-processing software. Continuing research is ongoing, with Dugway Proving Ground purchasing 2 of them for continued research and improvement. And for the conclusions, any reduction of trafficking is beneficial to limiting military vehicle off-road dust emissions and after traffic sites being susceptible to wind erosion. Therefore, limiting off-road trafficking to essential trafficking only should be the first management goal. If off-road trafficking is required, limit the amount of turning required, especially for the heavy and/or track-based military vehicles. The heavier the vehicle, the greater the shear forces impacting the surface when turning. The same applies to tracked vehicles because the tracks tend to shear the surface rather than attempting to slide over the surface when turning. Since the damage is cumulative, but greatest for the initial pass, it is usually desirable for heavy and/or tracked vehicles to follow the same path as much as possible to reduce the total surface area being impacted, even if the cumulative effect of multiple passes increases the susceptibility to total vehicle dust emissions at the time. The reduced area impacted will lower the risk and degree of wind erosion following trafficking. In addition, it will reduce the total area that may require remediation to repair off-road tracks and encourage vegetation regrowth in the future. If the vehicles are lighter weight and/or wheeled and surface conditions are favorable, the damage from the initial off-road pass may cause insignificant damage to the soil and vegetation. Thus, there would not be an appreciably elevated risk to wind erosion unless or until successive passes along that same path are conducted. In this situation, it would normally be desirable to spread out the vehicles horizontally and not have them all follow the same off-road path, reducing the full cumulative damage effect of multiple off-road passes. Since such conditions would normally preclude the need for remedial action to reduce the risk of wind erosion, it benefits the DoD and the environment to forego such remedial management actions. Based upon the resampling conducted at the experimental sites, remedial management practices can enhance and speed up the process of revegetation and vegetation cover on damaged off-road traffic paths. The limiting factor to recovery is usually a lack of water, especially in the arid regions where we conducted many of our experiments. Simply having the ability to apply water to the trafficked off-road surfaces may be all that is necessary to initiate and boost the revegetation process. It may take as little as a single well-timed application of sufficient water to kickstart that revegetation process. Likewise, if it is desired that the traffic surface be smoothed out, especially where large ridges have been created by turning track vehicles, surface leveling operations could be conducted, such as blading or disking. Such remedial practices may make the surface more susceptible to wind erosion, though. So in such scenarios where smoothing out the surface was required, it may be more desirable then to follow up and kickstart the revegetation process with some watering practices, as previously mentioned. Another practice that may enhance remediation efforts is to apply additional native species seed to off-road sites. This would ensure that there is enough seed available to initiate the revegetation process and maximize the response to other remediation treatments, such as applying water to the site. This would be especially so for locations containing an insufficient existing seed bank in the soil. There are many equipment solutions available in the agricultural industry that could easily be modified and tailored to work well for the DoD as part of a remedial management plan for off-road trafficking. And for acknowledgements, I'd like to acknowledge my co-PIs, Dr. John Tatarko, Michael Wojak, and Ronaldo Maharang, and the former ITAM coordinator at Fort Riley, Dr. Philip Woodford, and Christopher Otto, Shannon Danley at Fort Benning, Peter Neeson at the Yakima Training Center, and Brian Wilson at White Sands Missile Range, as well as William Brown at the Dugway Proving Grounds. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the presentation, Larry. And at this time, I would like to remind our audience to submit questions by using the chat box on the left-hand portion of your screen. And we do have a number of questions on this first portion of the webinar that Larry will answer. Larry, the first question is, what type of downwind PM sensor is required with CLIS, and how much does that cost?
Okay. CLIS needs a downwind PM sensor to be used for automated calibration. That if they're wanting real PM concentration values along the line of sight or the beam of the Lidar. The uncertainty of that final Lidar-derived PM concentration is usually driven by the uncertainty of the PM sensor data and will be no better than plus or minus 10%. The output of that PM sensor needs to provide the particulate matter concentration in at least 5-minute intervals at a minimum. Better information can be provided by systems that produce data at a faster rate and or provide some particle size distribution information. There are several options for particulate matter sensors, with cost usually scaling inversely with the size of the error bars on the final particulate matter concentration readings. Less expensive and larger error bar solutions would be in the range of $5,000 to $10,000, with more expensive and smaller error bar solutions in the range of $50,000 to $100,000.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Can CLIS be used to monitor detonation product species?
What was the question again?
Can CLIS be used to monitor the products of detonation, specifically the different species of the detonation?
It could measure the particulate matter emissions that might have been generated by a munitions event like that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Can you comment on the challenges in determining what constitutes acceptable versus non-acceptable measured dust concentrations at the fence line?
That would end up having to be determined what level of emissions they're wanting to allow across that fence line. It may be EPA regulated emission levels that they're interested in. It may be visibility issues that they're interested in. So that level is dependent upon what they're looking for here.
Okay, thank you, Larry. In what conditions would CLIS not work well, or what conditions could cause it to fail in an unintended mode? Conditions such as rain, snow, or freezing temperatures, for example.
The command and control electronics should be operated within a protected environment or housing. In that temperature range that housing that they currently are using is between 10 and 35 degrees C. And the Lidar system can operate in a larger temperature range of from 1 to 40 degrees C. The laser inside the Lidar box is water cooled, so you do not want that water to freeze, or it would cause severe damage to the Lidar box's cooling system. Additional weatherization modifications could be made to extend that temperature range, and those extended temperature range conditions obviously need to be tested and evaluated first. Rain and snow on the windows can affect the return signal, so you should be protecting or covering as much of that as possible to prevent the effect on the return signal from rain and snow.
Okay, thank you, Larry. How often should CLIS be calibrated, or can that be handled by the downwind sensor automatically? And how often should that downwind sensor be serviced or calibrated to?
Calibrating the Lidar is dependent on both the downwind sensor and the parameter settings selected in the data processing. The current algorithm that they use is a post-processing procedure right now that calibrates the Lidar data on a continual basis. That frequency could be reduced in real-time operations under stable particulate matter composition conditions, but that would increase associated errors. If operation in an unintended mode were robustly developed, the Lidar would need to be checked 1 or 2 times a day with weekly or monthly interruptions to operations for servicing. Frequency of checking and servicing the downwind sensor depends on the system selected. There are several options, and each has advantages and disadvantages and the deployment conditions that are used. High dust environments would require more frequent servicing and calibration, perhaps monthly with weekly checks and operations in a lower particulate matter environment would require maybe only yearly calibration. So it depends on your conditions, what you're wanting to use it for.
Okay. And we have time for one last question before we move to the second presentation. Can you comment on whether there are numerical models that have the ability to predict how dust is loaded into the atmosphere under different land surface, vegetation conditions, or climate conditions?
Yes, there are models out there that do that. I'm not super familiar with those particular models, but there are dispersion models that will predict the amount of emissions that can come off of fields and then where it will go downwind. The model that most of my research has dealt with is the wind erosion model. We only deal with the emissions portion of it, but not where it goes once it leaves a cropland field. But that data could be tied into an emission or a dispersion model to let you know how the quantity and the of the material downwind changed and settled out and so forth.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Larry. And as a reminder to the audience, Larry will be back at the end of the webinar to answer some additional questions, some higher level questions, some broader ones. At this time, we'll move to the second presentation of the webinar. And this next part of the webinar will be presented by Dr. Jack Gillies. He is a research professor in the Division of Atmospheric Sciences of the Desert Research Institute in Reno, Nevada. Currently, his research focuses on the physics of sand transport and dust emission by wind and anthropogenic processes. Dr. Gillies has served as principal investigator on 3 CERTIP projects that have examined relationships between dust emissions and military testing and training activities. He has authored more than 70 peer-reviewed papers, many related to dust in the environment. Jack earned his degrees, including a doctoral degree in physical geography from the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. Jack?
Yes, hi. Thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. I'm going to talk to you about our most recent CERTIP project, looking at characterizing and quantifying dust emissions from DoD testing and training activities. And I'll introduce the rationale for that project to begin with. Then I'll switch to some key project results and outcomes that we had, how we transitioned this research to applications, and finally, moving forward from this work, the demonstration and certification opportunities we've done following on from this work, discuss the benefits to the Department of Defense, and present you with some conclusions from the work. And now I'll go to 44. So the project rationale was that we knew that mineral dust from Department of Defense testing and training activities has the potential to impact adversely the biophysical and human environment, both on an installation as exposed to the military personnel that are working there, and also off-site impacts from degradation of air quality. And the issue off-site is that this dust can leave the military installation and reach levels that exceed air quality standards. And there's a potential following from exceeding those standards that a military installation might be asked at some time to modify or curtail their activities that release dust so that the downwind effects are mitigated and move into below the air quality standards, so increasing the air quality. This is 45. The key project result number 1, I think, is that we identified critical source characteristics that influence dust emissions and developed emission factors for Department of Defense vehicle activities. Prior to this series of projects that we carried out, there was a very limited opportunity for a manager to go in and find out how much dust they might be creating from the activity that were going on their base. So we undertook many field studies to actually quantify and characterize how much dust is created by specific military activities. Number 46. And for example, after measuring emissions from various sources like low-level helicopter flight, artillery backblast, and a number of other things, we came to the realization that the tracked and wheeled vehicles were probably the most important source on a military installation during the testing and training activities. And most of the emissions could be quantified based on only measuring or having knowledge of two variables of the vehicles that were moving. And that specifically was the weight of the vehicle and the speed that that vehicle moves. And combining those two variables, you get the term vehicle momentum. And you can see from the figures on the right hand of slide 46 that you get a very nice scaling relationship between the vehicle momentum and the amount of PM that's released for every kilometer traveled by that vehicle. And there is a difference between the wheeled and the tracked vehicles. And in fact, usually because of the speed factor, that it's often that the wheeled vehicles can produce more per vehicle kilometer traveled than a tracked vehicle. Let's go 47. One of the other aspects of this project was the development of systems to measure the dust emission potential of areas on military installations. And two of those important things are the movement of the vehicles on unpaved roads and also the generation of wind-blown dust from bare areas or areas that had been degraded by military activity, as Larry discussed earlier. So there's many miles or kilometers of unpaved roads on these military installations, especially in the southwest U.S. And we developed a vehicle-based platform called Tracker, which can measure the grams of PM10 that are emitted per vehicle kilometer traveled. And you can use that information to map the sources and strengths of the dust source emissions along those unpaved roads. And as Larry showed in his presentation, we in part developed the PI-SWERL as part of our project, and it's been now used internationally by many people to look at the emission strength of different surfaces and their potential to release material, PM10 specifically, during for wind erosion events. It's like to 48. So slide 48 is a picture of the tracker in its current configuration, and it's gone through three different evolutionary periods during its development. It now resides, it strictly can fit everything into the bed of a 4x4 truck. It is used to measure the emission potential. It measures the strength of the concentrations in the wake of the vehicle that's created by its passage down the roadway. And all that information is logged and in a spatial GIS system so that we can then create maps of the emission strength of the road networks inside the Department of Defense installations, allowing managers to see where problem areas might be and where they could be targeted for remediation. The really good thing about using Tracker is that it can be used to represent other wheeled and tracked vehicles because of the linear scaling that we demonstrated in the previous slides. That once you know the emissions that are caused by Tracker, you can scale those emissions based on what they would be for another heavier vehicle moving at a faster or a slower speed. And you can also do it to model the emissions that might be coming from a tracked vehicle based, again, on the known weight and speed of the tracked vehicle. And one of the things we have did during the process of this executing this project was the measurement method, although divorced from tracker, the method itself of using a vehicle-borne measurement system to measure dust emissions has been accepted by the U.S. EPA as an other test method. That's what OTM stands for, OTM 34, and you can find that U.S. EPA OTM 34 on their website, and it gives welcome credibility to the measurement method and pretty robust presentation of results if you use this kind of information to develop your PM inventory for a military installation. So it could be really useful in developing management strategies and delivering information to the U.S. EPA like a PM inventory on an annual basis. Like slide number 49. So this is just an example. During the development phase, we took Tracker to the Dugway Proving Ground, and we used it to map the emission potential, dust emission potential of the road network. So it integrates these emission factor relationships and simplifies the quantification of the road dust emission inventories, as this can be drawn directly into simple spreadsheet kind of processing to come up with an PM emission inventory, either for on an annual basis or on a quarterly basis. So it could be it should be a useful tool for environmental managers at these bases who have to supply this kind of information. Larry introduced the PI-SWERL in his presentation. I'll just go into it a bit here on slide 50. If you're looking at a picture of the PI-SWERL sitting on a surface that's being tested for emissions, developing a dust emission relationship between the wind speed and PM10 that's released from that surface, and it travels around. It can be carried on the little carriage there. But it can also modify it to drive on other vehicles. Here in the lower picture, you're seeing its use at the Oceano Dunes State Vehicular Recreation area in Oceano, California, where I am right now, where we actually use the PI-SWERL to develop an emission grid for the whole dune system. And that enters into some modeling that we do to understand the downwind impact of the dust emissions from the Oceano dunes. Slide number 51, key project result number 3, is that as part of our measurement program that we were undertaking during the process, during our project, we were looking at whether you can identify and quantify the terrain properties that can attenuate the dust emission process as the dust plume is generated at the source and then interacts with the landscape as it moves downwind, and specifically how it interacts with different amounts of and types of vegetation. So if you look at slide 52, you can see that that the figure shows the deposition velocity, which is the scaling of how much the PM is interacting and depositing to the surface between the long grass prairie, which was in Kansas, down to a place with no vegetation. So you can see that the curves generally move up in scale towards the long grass, and altogether you're seeing that if you can maintain a fairly decent vegetation cover near the road source, you can influence the deposition factor up by about a factor of 3. So you're getting good removal in the near field zone, which we'll call 0 to 200 meters from the source. So it can be very useful in helping to mitigate the strength of the emissions, having the vegetation close to the road. And the more vegetation you have and the more roughness you create, the more you enhance the deposition of the emitted material in this near field zone. Slide number 53, result number 4. This project also worked with Pacific Northwest National Labs, who developed, as part of this project and a previous project, the dust transport model, which now exists as DustTran version 2.0. As someone asked in the questions section, this is an open source GIS-based emission and dispersion model that is freely available to military installations and can be used by DoD personnel and air quality managers to predict what the even in-base and out of installation PM might result from the military testing and training activities. If you go to slide 54, you predict the PM concentrations at a receptor based on inputting known testing and training activities, which could include the number and types of vehicles, where they're going to be traveling, the emission relationship for the roads they're traveling over, which you can get from information from Tracker, or otherwise you can also have information based on wind erosion events and meteorology and known surface characteristics, for example, that you may have acquired through the use of PI-SWERL. So in combination, DustTran takes in information from the emission side of things, applies a meteorological model, specifically AirMod, and combines that into dispersing the released PM10 from the military testing and training activity and moves it downwind under those conditions and predicts what the PM concentration might be at your fence line or further downwind. To slide 55, just an example of the contours of a PM10 concentration based on the wind that's carrying that emission source from a point source area at the Yakima Training Center. So the release happens. It could be from specifically, for example, artillery backblast or something, and you can then disperse that downwind. The model will carry it based on the wind field that the model has drawn in, either historical, which is usually historical data, or one could use it even in a prognostic situation. If you knew what the winds were going to be like in the future, you could get a good estimation of how that impact might be felt off base. Slide number 56. So this is where we have taken the research and moved it into an application mode from the results from this project. The Tracker system has been used to evaluate the road dust PM10 emissions at a number of installations. And one of the other things that we used it to do for Fort Irwin was to look at how the dust control effectiveness that they were applying to roadways at Fort Irwin, how effective it was it being cost effective, was it degrading, how well was it holding up to the convoys that were using the roads, and that allowed us to provide Fort Irwin with a potential cost-saving effort on how much dust suppressant they were adding was way overdone for the amount of dust that was coming off the roads. So the PI-SWERL has been used to evaluate wind-blown dust PM10 emissions, and that's a very effective thing. It's being done used by the California State Parks here at Oceano at the moment. And we can also use it to evaluate dust control effectiveness on area sources that have been treated potentially with mitigation efforts, and look at how well that's holding up over time, how fast it's degrading, and allow managers to determine if they've got a cost-effective product applied. Slide number 57, research to application. Well, we've also taken quantified the terrain properties that attenuate those emissions, and those have been integrated into the DustTran model and can use to provide more accurate estimates of dust emissions and their effect on the environment and the predicting downwind concentrations. The DustTran model is integrated now with can pull in tracker data, PI-SWERL data, and the terrain properties, so it can be used to evaluate the air quality impact of testing and training, both within an installation and exterior to an installation at downwind communities potentially. Slide number 58. We've managed to create potentially very easy to use methods for high quality characterization of dust emission using these EPA recognized methods for developing, for example, emission inventory reports, and also easy to use methods to assess dust suppressant activities effectiveness, ensuring best quality performance and cost savings for the military so they can use their dollars wisely. On slide number 59, the research application, the DustTran model has been used to evaluate off-site impacts of testing and training, for example, the movement of large convoys of vehicle. And we've developed these products to allow effective dust management plans to be developed and are available to be used by the military environmental management teams anywhere in the U.S. now. Slide number 60, we've actually are now in a ESTCP project with the title Mapping, Optimization of Controls and Reduction of Fence Line Impacts of Fugitive Dust Emissions from DoD roads, trails, and training areas, which is focusing on bringing the tracker measurement platform into certification. And as of yesterday, we have been confirmed that the 29 Palms Marine Base is going to serve as our location where we're going to be going through the certification process over the next 3 years. So that's a great news for this project. And this will also be available to other installations as well, should they be interested in joining this project. So slide number 61, just provide you some general conclusions. We generated DoD-specific emission sources and characterize them for use within for better characterizing these emissions and quantifying for them for the different installations who have different amounts of different source types. We've developed effective tools to measure these dust emission potential at any installation, and the methods that have been developed follow U.S. EPA recognized methods. The model developed, the DustTran model developed by PNNL, provides environmental managers a means to evaluate testing and training emissions on local and regional air quality. And we've developed new tools that are available to develop better informed dust management plans. And also I thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jack. Again, at this time, the audience is welcome to submit questions that Jack will answer, and we have already received a couple of great questions. So the first question, Jack, is from the Army Corps. Would differences in tire tread pattern influence fugitive dust emission potential, or would those differences be negligible compared to vehicle speed and weight?
Well, based on our measurements of many different wheeled and tracked vehicles, and we initially kept track of things like the number of wheels, not so much tread pattern, but at the end of the day, you couldn't tease out what are probably secondary effects of things like tire tread or tire width, that overwhelmingly 80% or more of the emissions could be explained by the two variables of vehicle weight and speed. So everything seemed to collapse into a generalized relationship regardless of the physical configuration of a wheeled vehicle. at least within the error that we were able to account for. It's likely more a secondary effect.
Okay, thank you very much. Which surface characteristics are used in DustTran? And that is a question, Jack, from the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory.
Yes, so DustTran will draw in information, I think, based on actually NRCS soil data. Then there is information drawn in from I can't actually remember where they draw their land use or land or terrain characteristics. But I can follow up on that and provide that information. If you can send me an email, I can put you in touch with the people at PNNL who would know the specifics of that.
Great. Besides wheeled and tracked vehicles, what other dust source specific to DoD have you looked at, and how do other dust sources compare to vehicles? Yeah,
so during the lifetime of our 3 projects, we looked at wheeled and tracked vehicles, artillery, dust emissions from artillery backblast, low-level helicopter or rotary-winged aircraft flight. And there are instances when something like a rotary-winged aircraft can produce an incredibly high level of dust, and hence the brownout problem for them. But it becomes a frequency magnitude effect when you're trying to evaluate what the larger environmental impacts are. So although a rotary-winged aircraft might release an incredible amount of dust, it does so for a very short time. So overall, it doesn't impact the larger environment as much as the more frequent activity of wheeled and tracked vehicle movement. Hence, that's what really became the driver for determining what the largest contributors are within the DoD. It appears that wheeled and tracked vehicles are for their frequency of use.
Okay, thank you. How do you use Tracker to determine a PM10 emission inventory for a base?
As Tracker travels over the unpaved road network, it's resolving the emissions in space and time. Every 10 meters of road or so is measured. And then we use a conversion factor developed from calibration to take that PM10 measurement and the vehicle speed and convert that into how many grams of PM10 were released over every kilometer traveled by the vehicle. And then simply it's a matter of adding up the vehicle miles traveled to get the Tracker total emissions. And then you can modify that based on if you had an inventory of what your vehicles were that were moving around your base over those same roads, knowing its weight and a typical speed it might be traveling. You can then do it for other vehicles and sum them up to provide your total tons of PM10 emitted for your time interval of interest.
Thank you. On a similar note, how could you use it to determine dust suppressant effectiveness in a similar way or a slightly different process?
Yeah, it's very similar. Once you basically have the reference from the untreated road that you operated Tracker on, you apply the dust suppressant, and then repeatedly through time you go back and you measure the same length of road that the application has been applied to. And then you can monitor how that emission strength changes as a function of time or wear and tear on the road based on the knowledge of some vehicle count that you're keeping track of. And the difference between that can be used to provide a percent effectiveness through time.
Okay. Thank you. And we have one more question from the audience that has just come in. Has Tracker been used to measure PM emissions from paved roads? And if so, is there a measurable amount of emissions from paved roads located near unpaved roads?
It can be used to measure paved roads. The current configuration has sort of is best suited to do unpaved roads, but we have a version that was originally developed and is still available to do emissions from paved roads. And that was based on, we've done it for the city of Las Vegas, and also in, I think, Boise, Idaho as well, has used that system to get more informed inventory on road dust emission from paved roads. So yes, that is available.
Excellent. And using the PI-SWERL, have you compared the threshold shear velocities associated with different roughness elements? Yes,
that was one of the original questions that we had about how the measurements were influenced by the roughness on which it was placed. And there's a detailed paper published in the journal Aeolian Research where we looked at how the shear stress was affected by a range of roughness, and there are now available correction factors to modify the shear velocity measurement based on some knowledge of the surface roughness. So it can be taken into account to modify the threshold.
Great.
And if somebody, if the questioner wants to send me an email, I can send them the paper that would guide them through that process.
Perfect. We have one last question for you, Jack, before we bring Larry back for the final Q&A session. And that is, how can DoD environmental base managers access and utilize these tools, Tracker, PI-SWERL, or DustTran, or get help with dust management?
Yeah, so I am basically the point of contact for that, and I can facilitate the use of these tools for your on the military installations, and I can also put people in contact with with Pacific Northwest National Labs and the links to obtain DustTran and undergo a training session to help them be able to use it. So if anyone is interested and wants to, or is considering that these tools might be useful for them, I am the primary point of contact, so you can either email me or my contact information is provided on the slide.
Great. Thank you. And at this time, we'll bring Larry back and ask a few last questions to both of our presenters from today. The first question relates to environmental impacts. Can you each talk a little bit more about what kinds of environmental impacts result from dust emissions? And Jack, we'll start with you.
Well, so environmental impacts can result from the dust emission process, both at the source and downwind at some receptor. Downwind, when we have air quality degradation, we think of effects on the human environment and effects that might be on human health due to high dust loadings and the effect on respiration. At the source, when you have dust emissions, you're also removing some very important components of your source material that supports the health of the environment, of the ecosystem. So loss of fine particles means a loss of those components of the soil system that carry a lot of the nutrients. So you can have a degradation at source of the environment and the ecosystem, and you can have a degradation downwind in the human environment due to the effects of PM on respiratory health.
Thank you, Jack. Larry, do you have anything to add to that?
Want to repeat the question first?
Sure. What environmental impacts result from dust emissions?
Now, one of the things that can happen from dust emissions, if it's saltating material, it may be somewhat damaging to vehicles and plants that are being impacted downwind from the larger particles. Jack didn't mention, usually occurring during wind erosion events. And as he mentioned, material leaving from the source, at least, is usually the higher productive material of the soil, which is beneficial for crop growth and plant growth and all kinds of vegetation growth. So that's where the degradation of the soil occurs from wind erosion events.
Okay, thank you, Larry. The next I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the next steps in your work. So we will start with Larry. Larry, what still needs to be done to make, I believe it's Sealess, a product that can be purchased and used reliably by DoD in an unattended mode after setup?
Well, used in an unattended mode, it needs to have some additional software provided so that the data can be analyzed on-site rather than doing everything off-site, and being able to deploy that system where you don't have to have an operator that is highly trained, be able to get it calibrated and set up and configured. There's a lot of those kinds of issues that need to be dealt with Sealess so that you can send out a properly trained individual to do that kind of stuff, but not one that has to have explicit week-long worth of specialized training to be able to do that kind of work.
Okay, thank you. And Jack, any thoughts on next steps for the work that you presented today?
Well, we think we've got some tools at hand, and our next job is to try to get them out more broadly for use by the DoD, and in part, we feel that our ESTCP project will definitely help us do that.
Excellent, thank you. Just one last final question to wrap up today. Jack and Larry, what is the last message that you would like to leave our audience with today? Larry, we'll start with you.
Well, I think from our project, the real takeaway is that we've got lots of good data for developing additional algorithms. We've done some of that as a part of this project as far as compaction, response equations, and vegetation decay due to multi-trafficking events, and also with the development of Sealess. And in the future, we would expect that there will be additional evaluations of some of the potential remedial practices that we think will be very beneficial to remediating some of these sites that have multiple off-road trafficking damage done to them.
Great. Thank you so much, Larry. And Jack, what's the main takeaway and the last message you'd like to leave with the audience?
Well, I think this series of projects that you've heard about today really should feel confident that there are ways for and means and information now to help environmental managers who have to develop dust management plans for their installations to reduce this impact on the environment. And Larry and I are prime contacts to help you out with that, for doing that.
Great. Well, thank you to both of our speakers today for the wonderful presentations and answering so many questions from the audience. And to the audience, please visit the CERDIP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register for future webinars in 2018. The next webinar is on March 22nd, and it's on cloud computing services for DoD. And before we conclude, I would like to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the presentation of today's session will be archived on our webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. And we would appreciate it if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at this time. This concludes today's webcast. Thank you.